Regrarians was conceived in about 2012 as a word. It was something that we'd been working towards for a long time, trying to actually give ourselves an identity that fit with our values and what our interests were. The word comes from regenerative agrarian. And agrarian is obviously a very old word, and regenerative is an old word too, but it's obviously something that's becoming more pronounced these days, and we've been, as you said, involved in the regenerative agriculture field for a long time. So it sort of fit as a brand to identify what we do and how we feel about going about things. There's a process to all of this that there has to be. There's not so much a start and a finish, but at least when you're looking at design and projects, that there's a starting point. And for us, that's the climate and the climate of the mind. And so a lot of our work was based on Keyline design, which was developed by the late great P.A. Yeomans back in the 1940s and 50s. And he wrote a book in the 1958 called The Challenge of Landscape, and in that he had the Keyline scale of permanence. And so we found that as a really good basis for what we then called the Regrarians platform, which is based on the scale of permanence, but we added on economy and energy onto that and brought in the emphasis from holistic management and other methodologies of society and social aspects and economical aspects.
Mm-hmm. As Darren says, the climate of the mind is the hardest thing to change, and it can be especially so when you're working with farmers. So the climate of the mind is a really important part of the work that we do.
We also wanted to create something that was quite thorough, and that people could see a process too, in a methodology. And our approach is really that we've created a methodology of methodologies. Well, by identifying the concerns to start with. So, like I say, I'm starting with the climate for us. The climate is something that's relatively fixed and is such an influence over what agricultural outputs and management strategies producers undertake. But then there's also this climate of their minds, and so how are we going to mentally deal with the adversity of climate change? And for us in Australia, climate change is something that's omnipresent because Australia is reliably unreliable in terms of its climate because of its peculiar geography in being surrounded by sea, which has a huge influence in terms of its shape and its latitude. So it's something that Australians are quite familiar with, but it's getting worse and getting harder, especially as soil carbon levels decrease, and so the capacity of the soil and the landscape to remain humid becomes even more difficult. So for us, it's about adaptation and mitigation. So focusing on the soil, but also focusing on what's the best thing that we should work on first. What's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck? How can we use the resources that we have, economic, social, landscape, to get us so that we can work within the restrictions of climate change. I mean, we all have to do our part. It's going to happen. It is happening. But what can we do to mitigate it? Because there's certainly clearly strategies that work for that. Yeah.
Many trees.
Yeah.
I mean, Darren says you've got to have blue, which is water, before you have green, which is
vegetation
and
money, cash flow, before you're green and black. So black meaning profit and carbon. So you have to be blue before you're green and black. And that again is is a climate change adaptation strategy. Well, when P.A. Yeomans released his first book, The Australian Keyline Plan, in 1954, it was an instant bestseller, which is unusual for an agricultural book, and it was the first book ever written on broad-scale landscape design, functional landscape design, and so that was pretty revolutionary as a process, and for a lot of people. And Keyline is fundamentally a farm planning system whose primary object is the control of water, because the control of water within an agricultural landscape is the control of your destiny as much as anything else. Obviously, your management is very important. Your attitude, the way that you manage your books, all of those things are important. But the management of water is absolutely critical, particularly in seasonal rainfall environments, which basically all of Australia is. And now that climate change is sort of biting across the planet, more places are becoming like Australia, and so we're finding that Keyline is taking a place in a lot of other environments where before rainfall patterns were much more reliable than what they are now. So that said, most farms are not well designed. In fact, they're not designed. They just happen. They're the result of incremental development in positioning of fencing and positioning of roads and ponds or dams and all sorts of other infrastructure. Whereas Keyline creates a plan which is based on the climate and its relationship to the geography and the topography around where you place water, where you place roads, where you put trees, where you put buildings, and where you put fencing, and then how do you quickly create living soil out of dead topsoil, which Yeomans was another great exponent of through his Keyline pattern cultivation techniques, and also as an early adopter of Rousson's rotational grazing and electric fencing and all of those sorts of things. So that's the fundamental basis of it. And a lot of Yeoman's work, if you look at his old farms, they're still a very unusual landscape, unfortunately, but they're beautiful and they were very productive and very functional, and still work after being abandoned in many cases for 50 plus years. So, which I think says a lot.
Drought-proof and waterproof.
Yeah.
Drought-proof and fireproof.
It is one part. I wouldn't say that it's the whole part. A lot of people, when they think of Keyline, they think of the Keyline plough, and I think that's reasonable. But for me, Keyline is a farm planning system. It's not about the tool. It's about the management and the practice of planning. There isn't any one philosophy that's worked, in our opinion, that a producer or a person should follow. That there's been some great minds and communities who've come up with some fantastic insights, and that it's better that we bring them into a whole as opposed to all of these individual wholes, which people tend to follow.
Well, you've got to have a toolbox. You don't usually just have one tool.
Yeah.
And the thing with the Keyline plough that's different to other ploughs is that it's not, ripping and turning the soil. It's going in and aerating. So it's a totally different style of plough. Much gentler.